What happens when a mail-order bride gets rejected for looking too sickly and worthless? Only to reveal she's hiding medical skills that could save an entire valley from disaster. Catherine Sullivan's journey from Dublin's medical halls to Montana's frozen frontier will challenge everything you think you know about love, healing, and second chances. When cowboy Daniel Mackenzie finds her abandoned in a snowstorm, neither expects that her carefully guarded secret will become the key to saving his dying cattle and his broken heart. This is a story of hidden identities, dangerous pursuits, and the healing power of unexpected love. If you enjoy emotional Western romances with strong heroines and plot twists that'll keep you guessing, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. I don't need your kind of help. Rejected brides, hidden medical skills, save ranch, and find love. The train's whistle cut through the Montana winter like a blade through silence, its echo bouncing off the snow-capped peaks that surrounded Silver Creek. Catherine Sullivan pressed her palm against the frosted window, watching the small frontier town emerge from the white wilderness like something from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Her breath fogged the glass as she studied the wooden buildings lined up along the main street, their rooftops heavy with snow that glittered in the late afternoon sun. After 3 weeks of travel from Dublin through New York and across the endless American plains, this was supposed to be her sanctuary, her new beginning. If only the man waiting for her knew the truth about who she really was. Catherine gathered her threadbare shawl around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the small leather journal hidden in her corset, the only thing she had left of her father's revolutionary medical research. Everything else had been left behind in the ashes of their Dublin laboratory, along with the life she'd been forced to abandon. The conductor's voice boomed through the car. Silver Creek, Montana. End of the line. Her hands trembled as she reached for the carpet bag at her feet. Inside lay the letters from Theodore Blackwood, the banker who had answered her advertisement for correspondence and eventual marriage. His words had been proper, if not warm, seeking a suitable wife for frontier life, someone of good character and strong constitution. What he didn't know was that Catherine Sullivan possessed knowledge that could save lives or get her killed, depending on who discovered her secret. The train shuddered to a stop and Catherine rose on unsteady legs. 3 weeks of poor food and little sleep had taken their toll. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and her dress hung loose on her diminished frame. She knew she looked nothing like the photograph she'd sent to Theodore, a picture taken 2 years ago when she'd been healthy and hopeful before her world had collapsed. She stepped onto the platform, her boots crunching in the snow. The mountain air bit at her lungs, so different from Dublin's soft rain. Around her, other passengers reunited with loved ones or hurried toward waiting carriages. Catherine stood alone, searching the crowd for a face she'd never seen but hoped to recognize from his letters. Miss Sullivan. The voice was sharp, businesslike. Catherine turned to see a man approaching his expensive coat, marking him as someone of importance in this small town. He was shorter than she'd expected, with graying hair and calculating eyes that swept over her appearance with obvious displeasure. Mr. Blackwood. She managed a smile despite the sinking feeling in her stomach. I'm so pleased to finally meet you. Theodore Blackwood stopped 3 feet away, his expression growing colder by the second. His gaze traveled from her worn boots to her pale face, taking in every sign of her difficult journey. This is what you sent me, his voice carried enough for nearby passengers to hear. The photograph you provided was misleading, to say the least. Heat flooded Catherine's cheeks. I apologize if I look travel-worn, sir. The journey was longer than expected, and you look sickly, weak. Theodore's words cut like winter wind. I specifically requested a wife capable of frontier life, not some consumptive waif who'll be dead before spring. The other passengers began to stare, some with sympathy, others with the cruel curiosity that accompanied public humiliation. Catherine fought to maintain her dignity, her medical training helping her recognize that Theodore's rejection stemmed from more than just her appearance. If you'll allow me a few days to recover from the journey. No, Al. Theodore adjusted his gold pocket watch with deliberate precision. I've made other arrangements. There's a boarding house on 3rd Street that might take you in, though I doubt you can afford it long. The return train won't come for 2 weeks. With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Catherine standing alone on the platform as snow began to fall. The other passengers dispersed quickly, eager to escape the awkwardness of witnessing a stranger's humiliation. Soon only Catherine remained, her breath forming white clouds in the rapidly cooling air. The sun had disappeared behind the mountains, and the temperature was dropping fast. She picked up her carpet bag with numb fingers and began walking toward town. Her thin shawl provided little protection against the wind that swept down from the peaks, carrying with it the promise of a harsh night ahead. The boarding house Theodore had mentioned was exactly where he'd said it would be, but one look at the prices posted in the window told Catherine what she'd already suspected: she couldn't afford even one night. The coins in her purse wouldn't last a week, let alone two. As she stood reading the rates, snow accumulated on her shoulders. Her feet had lost feeling entirely, and she could taste blood where she'd bitten her lip to keep from crying. Not here, she told herself. Not in front of strangers in this foreign place. Ma'am, the voice behind her was deep, hesitant. Catherine turned to find a tall man watching her from beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat. He had the weathered face of someone who spent his days outdoors, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. But it was his expression of genuine concern that nearly undid her careful composure. "You've been standing here for near 20 minutes, he said gently. "Storm's getting worse." Catherine became aware that snow was indeed falling harder, now the flakes fat and wet against her face. I, I'm quite all right, thank you." The man studied her with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading signs of distress in animals and humans alike. "No, ma'am, you're not. When's the last time you ate something?" The question caught her off guard. When had she last eaten? The train had served meals, but they'd been expensive and terrible. She'd survived mostly on the bread and cheese she'd brought from New York, rationing it carefully. "I don't see how that's your concern," she said, but the words came out weaker than intended. "Name's Daniel Mackenzie. Dan." He touched the brim of his hat. "I own the Circle M ranch about 5 miles out. And right now I'm concerned because there's a lady standing in a snowstorm with nowhere to go, looking like she's about to fall over." Catherine wanted to protest that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself, but a wave of dizziness chose that moment to wash over her. She swayed on her feet, and Dan immediately stepped forward, catching her elbow with a gentle but firm grip. "Easy there." His voice held the same tone she'd heard him use with frightened animals. "When's the last time you slept in a real bed?" 3 weeks ago. The admission slipped out before she could stop it. "In New York." Dan's expression darkened. 3 weeks. What kind of man leaves a woman to... He stopped himself, clearly recognizing the situation. "Theodore Blackwood." Catherine's silence was answer enough. "Son of a bitch," Dan muttered under his breath. Then louder, "Pardon my language, ma'am, but that man's got no business calling himself a gentleman." The snow was falling harder now, and the wind had picked up. Catherine could barely feel her hands, and she suspected her lips were turning blue. She needed shelter, but pride warred with practicality in her exhausted mind. "The boarding house seems," she began, "closed up for winter repairs last week." Dan interrupted. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned it yesterday. Next closest place is Copper Falls, 40 miles south, and the road's already snowed in." Despair washed over Catherine like the cold wind. 40 miles might as well be 400 in her condition. She looked around the small town, noting how the lights and windows seemed warm and inviting, but all belonging to other people's lives. "I have a suggestion," Dan said carefully. "My ranch has a guest room. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. You could stay there until the weather clears and the next train comes." Catherine's medical training immediately cataloged the risks of accepting help from a stranger, but it also cataloged the symptoms she was experiencing: hypothermia, exhaustion, malnutrition. Without shelter, she wouldn't survive the night. "I couldn't impose." "Ma'am, with respect, you're not imposing if I'm offering. And right now, you're about 10 minutes from collapse. I can see it in your color." His matter-of-fact tone reminded her of the professors at Trinity College, men who dealt in observable facts rather than social niceties. There was something reassuring about his directness. "I don't even know you," she whispered. "True enough, but I know hypothermia when I see it, and I know that Theodore Blackwood just left a woman to freeze rather than act like a decent human being." Dan's jaw tightened. "My mama raised me better than to walk away from someone in need." Another wave of dizziness hit her stronger this time. Catherine found herself reaching for Dan's offered arm, her body making the decision her mind still debated. Just until the weather clears, she managed. Just until then on, he agreed, though something in his tone suggested he didn't mind if it took a while. Dan guided her toward a covered wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. The animals stamped and snorted in the cold, their breath forming clouds of steam. He helped her up onto the bench seat and wrapped a thick buffalo robe around her shoulders. "This'll keep the wind off," he said, settling beside her and taking up the reins. "It's not far, but the road gets rough once we leave town." As the wagon pulled away from Silver Creek, Catherine allowed herself to relax for the first time in weeks. The buffalo robe smelled of outdoors and honest work, so different from the stale air of trains and boarding houses. Despite her exhaustion, she found herself studying Dan's profile as he drove. He had strong hands on the reins, scarred from years of work, but gentle with the horses. When he spoke to the animals, his voice carried a patience that spoke of someone comfortable with caring for living things. There was something wounded about him, though a careful distance in the way he held himself, as if he'd learned not to get too close to anything he might lose. "Can I ask what brought you all the way from Ireland?" he said after they'd traveled in comfortable silence for several minutes. Catherine tensed. She'd prepared a story for Theodore, carefully crafted to reveal nothing of her real background. But sitting next to this man who'd shown her kindness when she'd needed it most, the lies felt heavy on her tongue. "Family circumstances," she said finally. "I needed to start over somewhere new." Dan nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. Sometimes a person needs distance from their past to figure out who they're meant to be. His words carried the weight of personal experience, and Catherine wondered what had driven him to this remote ranch. She was about to ask when the wagon crested a small hill and she saw the Circle M spread out below them. Even in the gathering darkness, she could see it was a substantial operation. The main house was large but simple, built of logs with a wide front porch. Barns and outbuildings dotted the landscape, and she could make out dark shapes of cattle huddled against the storm. "It's beautiful," she said and meant it. "It suits me," Dan replied. "Quiet, peaceful, room to think." As they approached the house, Catherine noticed something that made her medical instincts prick with concern. Several of the cattle in the near pasture were lying down in unusual positions, and even in the snow, she could see that they weren't moving with the restless energy of healthy animals seeking shelter. "Your cattle," she said carefully. "Have they been well lately?" Dan's hands tightened on the reins. "Lost 3 this week, don't know why. They just waste away, stop eating, stop moving, then they're gone." Catherine's mind immediately began cataloging possibilities. Disease poisoning, nutritional deficiency. In Dublin, she'd studied veterinary medicine alongside human medicine, understanding that the principles of healing often cross species lines. "Have you had a veterinarian examine them?" "Nearest animal doctor is in Helena, 150 miles east. By the time word gets to him and he makes the trip out here, it'd be too late for whatever's ailing them." As they pulled up to the house, Catherine found herself studying the affected animals with professional interest. The symptoms Dan described could indicate several conditions, most of them treatable if caught early enough. "Here we are," Dan said, climbing down from the wagon. He came around to help her down, and Catherine was grateful for his steady hand as her legs nearly buckled. The warmth that greeted them when Dan opened the front door was like a physical embrace. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, its flames casting dancing shadows on log walls. Simple furniture spoke of function over decoration, but everything was clean and well-maintained. "Guest room's upstairs," Dan said, leading her toward a wooden staircase. "There's extra quilts in the chest at the foot of the bed, and I'll bring up some hot water for washing." The room he showed her was small but comfortable, with a real bed covered in thick quilts and a window that would offer views of the ranch once daylight returned. After weeks of trains and uncertainty, it felt like luxury. "Thank you," Catherine said, her voice thick with exhaustion and gratitude. "I don't know how I can repay your kindness." "No need," Dan replied. "My wife always said helping folks was its own reward." The past tense wasn't lost on Catherine, and she understood now some of the sadness she'd seen in his eyes. But before she could formulate a response, he'd excused himself to tend to the animals. Alone in the quiet room, Catherine finally allowed herself to acknowledge how close that she'd come to disaster. If Dan hadn't found her, if he hadn't been the kind of man to help a stranger, she pushed the thought away and focused instead on the immediate tasks at hand. She needed to rest to regain her strength. But more than that, she needed to decide how much of the truth she could safely share with her rescuer. Because if his cattle were suffering from what she suspected her medical knowledge might be the only thing standing between Dan Mackenzie and financial ruin. And if she helped him, if she revealed even a fraction of what she knew, there would be questions. Questions that could lead to answers that might destroy the fragile safety she'd found. Catherine pulled her father's journal from its hiding place and held it against her chest. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, and she could almost feel the weight of all the knowledge contained within its pages. Knowledge that could heal or kill, depending on who possessed it. Outside, the wind howled around the house and snow continued to fall. But for the first time in months, Catherine Sullivan felt warm and safe. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she would rest. She had no way of knowing that downstairs Dan Mackenzie was staring into the fire and wondering why the arrival of one Irish woman felt like the beginning of something that would change his life forever. Or that in the barn another of his cattle was beginning to show the early signs of the disease that had already claimed 3 of his animals. The disease that Catherine's father had spent his final years learning to cure. Catherine woke to the sound of men's voices drifting up from the kitchen below. Pale morning light filtered through the frost-covered window, revealing a world transformed by snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape so pristine and beautiful it made her chest ache. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the luxury of a warm bed and peaceful sleep. Then reality intruded. She was a stranger in this house, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew with no money and no prospects. And if her suspicions about his cattle were correct, Dan Mackenzie needed her help, whether he knew it or not. She rose and dressed quickly, grateful for the pitcher of warm water Dan had left outside her door. Her reflection in the small mirror showed improvement color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes no longer held the glazed exhaustion that had marked her arrival. Downstairs, she found Dan seated at a rough wooden table with another man she didn't recognize. Both men stood as she entered, and Dan's companion removed his hat to reveal graying hair and kind eyes. "Miss Sullivan, this is Father Murphy from the church in town," Dan said. "Father, this is the lady I mentioned." The priest's smile was warm. "Miss Sullivan, Daniel tells me you've had quite an ordeal. I hope you're feeling better this morning." "Much thank you." Catherine accepted the chair Dan pulled out for her, noting the careful way both men treated her with respect, but also with the gentle concern reserved for someone recovering from illness. "I brought some supplies from town," Father Murphy continued, indicating a basket on the counter. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store sends her regards and some of her famous apple preserves." Dan poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug and set it before Catherine. The brew was strong and black, warming her from the inside out. "Father Murphy knows most everyone who comes through Silver Creek. I thought you might appreciate seeing a friendly face." What he didn't say, but Catherine understood, was that the priest's presence served as both character reference and chaperone. In a small frontier town, a single woman staying with a bachelor rancher would cause talk. "You're very thoughtful," she said, meaning it. As they shared breakfast, eggs, bacon, and biscuits that Dan had prepared with surprising skill, Catherine found herself relaxing in the easy conversation between the two men. Father Murphy spoke of town gossip and weather predictions, while Dan listened with the patience of someone accustomed to his own company. But Catherine noticed that Dan's attention kept drifting toward the window, where the pasture was visible in the morning light. Following his gaze, she could see the cattle more clearly now, and her medical instincts sharpened. Several animals stood apart from the herd, their heads hanging low. Others lay in positions that suggested weakness rather than rest. The symptoms were becoming more pronounced. "Dan," she said carefully, about your cattle. The ones that have been ill, did they show any particular symptoms before they died?" Both men looked at her with surprise. It wasn't the kind of question most women of the era would ask, let alone with such clinical precision. "Well," Dan said slowly, "they stopped eating first. Then they got weak in their hindquarters, like they couldn't hold themselves up. Toward the end, they had trouble breathing." Catherine's pulse quickened. The progression Dan described matched exactly what her father had documented in his research. "And the deaths, were they spread across the herd or concentrated in one area?" "Mostly the animals that grazed near the east pasture," Dan replied. "Why do you ask?" Father Murphy was watching Catherine with sharp intelligence. "You speak of cattle disease with unusual knowledge, my dear." Catherine realized she was walking into dangerous territory. In 1884, Montana women weren't expected to understand veterinary medicine. But looking at Dan's worried expression and thinking of the animals suffering outside, she made a calculated decision. In Ireland, my family kept livestock, she said, which was true. Her father had studied animals as well as humans. I helped tend them when they were sick. It was a careful half-truth designed to explain her knowledge without revealing its true source. Dan's expression brightened with interest. Did you ever see anything like what's affecting my herd? Catherine chose her words carefully. There are several conditions that could cause such symptoms. Have you checked their water source? Sometimes minerals in the water or contamination can cause illness. Dan and Father Murphy exchanged looks. The spring that feeds the east pasture comes down from the old mining claim up on Eagle Ridge, Dan said. Haven't thought much about it since the mine closed 5 years ago. Mining operations can leave residues in the water supply, Catherine said again, staying within the bounds of what a knowledgeable farmer's daughter might reasonably know. Copper led other minerals that are harmless to the land but dangerous to animals. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Father Murphy breathed. Pardon the language, Miss Sullivan, but that never occurred to any of us. Dan was already reaching for his coat. I need to check that spring. If you're right, if something from the mine is poisoning the water. I could come with you, Catherine offered, then immediately regretted the boldness. That is, if you think another pair of eyes might be helpful. Dan hesitated, clearly torn between accepting help and maintaining propriety. Father Murphy solved the dilemma by standing and reaching for his own coat. Excellent idea. A small party can cover more ground, and I confess I'm curious about this theory myself. An hour later, the three of them were riding toward the eastern boundary of Dan's property. Catherine had borrowed some of Dan's late wife's riding clothes, practical wool pants, and a warm jacket that fit reasonably well. She hadn't been on horseback in months, but her body remembered the rhythm quickly. The ride gave her time to study the landscape with a physician's eye for environmental health factors. The east pasture was slightly lower than the rest of Dan's land, which would make it a natural collection point for runoff from higher elevations. If the abandoned mine was leaching contaminated water, this area would show the effects first. They found the spring exactly where Dan had indicated, a natural pool fed by a stream that cascaded down from Eagle Ridge. At first glance, it appeared pristine, surrounded by snow and winter-bare trees. But Catherine noticed things the others missed: a slight discoloration in the rocks around the pool, a faint metallic smell that became apparent when the wind shifted, and most tellingly, the absence of the small wildlife that should be drawn to a freshwater source. The water looks clean enough, Father Murphy observed. Sometimes the most dangerous contamination is invisible, Catherine replied, dismounting to examine the area more closely. Dan, do you have something I could use to collect a water sample? Dan produced a small glass jar from his saddlebag, and Catherine carefully collected water from both the spring itself and from points along the stream. As she worked, she noticed something that confirmed her suspicions: mineral deposits along the stream bed that had the distinctive blue-green tinge of copper compounds. We should test this water, she said, straightening. And in the meantime, you need to move your cattle away from this pasture. Test it how? Dan asked. Nearest laboratory is probably in Denver. Catherine's mind raced. She had the knowledge to perform basic water quality tests, but she lacked the equipment. However, there were simpler methods. Her father had taught her techniques that could be performed with household materials. There are ways to test for common contaminants, she said carefully. Simple chemical reactions that can indicate the presence of dangerous minerals. Both men stared at her. She'd clearly stepped beyond what they expected from a farmer's daughter from Ireland. Miss Sullivan, Father Murphy said gently, forgive me, but you speak with remarkable expertise for someone who merely helped tend family livestock. Catherine realized she'd reached a crossroads. She could retreat into vague explanations and possibly watch Dan's cattle die from preventable poisoning. Or she could trust these men with a small portion of the truth. My father was more than a simple farmer, she said finally. He had some medical training. He taught me things about animal health that most people wouldn't know. It was still far from the complete truth, but it was more honesty than she'd offered anyone since leaving Dublin. Dan was studying her with new interest. What kind of medical training? Enough to recognize mineral poisoning in livestock, Catherine replied, meeting his gaze steadily. And enough to know that if we don't act quickly, you're going to lose more cattle. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts. Catherine found herself watching Dan's profile, noting the way his jaw tightened when he looked toward his suffering animals. This ranch clearly meant everything to him, and the loss of his herd would be devastating. She'd seen that same determination to heal, that same personal investment in preventing suffering in her father's face when he worked. It was what had driven him to pursue research that others called impossible, what had ultimately cost him his life. Back at the house, Catherine asked Dan for access to his kitchen and any basic household chemicals he might have. While he gathered supplies, she studied the water samples more closely, noting details that confirmed her initial assessment. "What exactly are you planning to do?" Dan asked, watching as she arranged items on the kitchen table. "A simple test for copper contamination," Catherine replied, adding a few drops of vinegar to one of the water samples. "If I'm right, we should see." The water immediately began to turn a faint blue-green color. Dan sucked in a breath and Father Murphy crossed himself. "Mother of God," the priest whispered. "It's poisoned." "Copper sulfate contamination, most likely," Catherine confirmed. "Probably leaching from the abandoned mine works. It builds up in an animal system over time, causing the exact symptoms you've described." Dan sank into a chair, running a hand through his hair. 20 head of cattle using that pasture. I've probably lost more than I've saved." "Not necessarily," Catherine said quickly. "If we move them to clean pasture and provide proper treatment, many of them can recover. Copper poisoning is serious, but it's not always fatal if caught in time." "Treatment?" Dan's head snapped up. "You know how to treat mineral poisoning in cattle?" Catherine hesitated. What she was about to suggest would require her to reveal knowledge that went far beyond anything a farmer's daughter should possess. "There are methods," she said carefully, "certain compounds that can help remove excess minerals from an animal's system, but it would require—" She stopped, realizing she was about to propose administering medical treatments to valuable livestock based on knowledge she supposedly didn't possess. Father Murphy was watching her with the sharp intelligence she'd noticed earlier. "Miss Sullivan, I think it's time you told us exactly what kind of medical training your father provided." Catherine looked between the two men, Dan with his desperate hope for his animals, Father Murphy with his gentle but persistent curiosity. Outside, cattle were suffering from a condition she knew how to treat. She could save them, but only if she revealed more of herself than was safe. "My father was a physician," she said finally, "in Dublin. He studied both human and animal medicine, believing that healing principles applied across species." Dan leaned forward. "And he taught you everything he could, including how to treat mineral poisoning." Catherine took a deep breath. "I can save your cattle, Dan. But if I do, you'll know that I'm not just some farmer's daughter who happened to know a bit about livestock." The kitchen fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Catherine waited, her heart pounding, for their reaction to her partial confession. "Can you really help them?" Dan asked quietly. "Yes." "Then I don't care what you are or where you came from," he said firmly. "If you can save my animals, I'll be grateful for the rest of my life." Father Murphy nodded slowly. "God works through many hands, my dear. If he's given you the knowledge to prevent suffering, then it's your duty to use it." Catherine felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. For the first time since fleeing Dublin, she wasn't hiding who she truly was. At least not entirely. "We'll need to move the affected cattle immediately," she said, shifting into the clinical mode that felt like coming home. "And I'll need to prepare treatments. Do you have a place where we can isolate them?" "The south barn," Dan said immediately. "It's got good drainage and enough stalls for 20 head. "Perfect. We'll also need clean water, molasses, certain herbs if you have them." As Catherine outlined the treatment protocol, she watched Dan's expression transform from despair to hope. It was the same look she'd seen on countless faces in her father's Dublin practice, the relief of finding help when all seemed lost. What she didn't know was that 50 miles away in Silver Creek, Theodore Blackwood was receiving a telegram that would change everything. A telegram from men who had been searching for a woman named Catherine Sullivan, wanted in connection with the death of Professor James Sullivan in Dublin. Men who were willing to pay handsomely for information about her whereabouts. And that in the coming days, her choice to reveal her medical knowledge would set in motion events that would threaten not only her newfound safety, but the life of the man who had offered her shelter when she needed it most. But for now, there were cattle to save, and for the first time in months, Catherine Sullivan felt like herself again. The treatment of Dan's cattle took 3 days of intensive work, but the results were undeniable. Of the 20 animals that had shown symptoms of copper poisoning, 18 made full recoveries under Catherine's care. The two losses had been too far gone when treatment began, but even those deaths served to confirm her diagnosis when she performed post-mortem examinations that revealed the characteristic tissue damage of mineral toxicity. Word of the miraculous recovery spread quickly through the sparsely populated valley. Other ranchers began arriving at the Circle M, seeking Catherine's advice for their own livestock problems. She helped where she could, always careful to frame her knowledge in terms of her father's teachings rather than her own formal education. But success brought visibility, and visibility brought danger. On the fourth morning after the water contamination discovery, Catherine was in the barn checking on the recovering cattle when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the ranch. Through the barn door, she could see a group of riders cresting the hill, more than Dan usually received, and moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of neighboring ranchers. Something about their formation made her medical instincts prick with alarm. These men weren't coming for advice about sick cattle. Miss Sullivan, Dan's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. Catherine stepped out of the barn to find him standing on the front porch, his hand resting on the rifle he kept by the door. The approaching riders had spread out in a way that suggested tactical training rather than casual visit. "Get in the house," Dan said quietly as she approached. "Something's not right about this." Before Catherine could respond, the riders drew close enough for her to see their faces clearly. Her blood turned to ice. The lad rider was Theodore Blackwood, but it was the two men flanking him that made her heart stop. She knew those faces, had seen them in the shadows outside her father's laboratory in the weeks before his death. They were the men who had been asking questions about Professor Sullivan's research, the same men she'd fled from across an ocean. "Daniel Mackenzie," Theodore called out, his voice carrying the false joviality of someone attempting to disguise hostile intent. "I understand you've been harboring a fugitive." Dan's grip tightened on his rifle. "I don't know what you're talking about, Blackwood. The woman you're protecting isn't who she claims to be," Theodore continued, dismounting with theatrical confidence. "Her real name is Catherine Sullivan, and she's wanted in connection with the death of a prominent physician in Dublin." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. Somehow, impossibly, they had found her. But how she'd been so careful had changed her name in her correspondence with Theodore. Miss Sullivan, one of the flanking riders, spoke with an Irish accent she recognized with sick certainty. Or should we say Dr. Catherine Sullivan? The title hit like a physical blow. They knew, not just her name, but her true identity. The secret she'd guarded so carefully had been exposed. Dan stepped protectively in front of her, his rifle now openly displayed. "I don't care what you think you know. This lady is under my protection, and you're not welcome on my land." "Your protection?" Theodore laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. "Mackenzie, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. This woman is a criminal." "That's a lie," Catherine said, finding her voice despite her terror. She stepped out from behind Dan, meeting the accusing stares directly. "I've committed no crime." The Irish rider, she remembered now, his name was Connor, smiled coldly. "Then why did you flee Dublin the same night your father's laboratory burned? Why did you disappear with his research notes?" Catherine's hand involuntarily moved toward her bodice where her father's journal remained hidden. The gesture wasn't lost on the watching men. "Research that belongs to certain interested parties," the second rider added. His accent was American, but his eyes held the same calculating coldness as his companion. "Research that could be worth a great deal of money to the right buyers." Understanding flooded through Catherine with sickening clarity. Her father hadn't been killed for his political views or his controversial medical practices. He'd been murdered for his research into mineral poisoning and his treatment knowledge that would be valuable to mining companies who wanted to continue operations without regard for environmental consequences. And Theodore Blackwood, respectable banker and pillar of the Silver Creek community, was working with them. "You set this up," she said, staring at Theodore, "the mail-order bride correspondence. You knew who I was from the beginning." Theodore's smile was triumphant. "We've been tracking you across 2 continents, my dear. When you answered that advertisement in the Boston newspaper, it was simply a matter of waiting for you to come to us." Dan was looking between Catherine and her accusers, his face grim with growing understanding. "What research? What are you people talking about?" Your houseguest's father developed revolutionary treatments for mineral poisoning, Connor explained with mock helpfulness. Methods that could save lives and prevent environmental damage from mining operations. Certain business interests would prefer such information remain unavailable. You mean they want to suppress it? Catherine said, her fear beginning to transform into anger. They want to bury treatments that could save lives because it might hurt their profits. Business is business, Theodore said with a shrug. And right now our business is collecting you and your father's research. You can come quietly or we can take you by force. Dan raised his rifle, the metallic click of the action loud in the mountain air. Like hell you will. Mackenzie, Theodore said patiently, there are 5 of us and 1 of you, and you're harboring a fugitive. Stand down. She's no fugitive, Dan replied steadily. She saved my cattle and probably half the herds in this valley. Whatever you think she's done, I don't believe it. Catherine felt her heart crack a little at his defense. He barely knew her true identity, but he was willing to risk his life to protect her. It was more loyalty than she'd ever expected to find, and it made what she had to do next even more difficult. Dan, she said quietly, you should step away. This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't, he replied without taking his eyes off the threatening riders. They want to hurt you, and you're under my protection. That makes it my fight. Connor was growing impatient. This is touching, but we have business to conduct. Miss Sullivan, you have something that belongs to our employers. Hand over your father's research and no one needs to get hurt. Catherine's mind raced through possibilities. She could surrender, try to protect Dan by going with them quietly. But she knew these men had no intention of letting witnesses live. They'd killed her father, burned his laboratory, and pursued her across an ocean. They weren't going to leave Dan alive to tell the story. The research isn't here, she said, which was technically true. The journal was on her person, not in the house. We'll see about that, the American rider said, dismounting and starting toward the house. Dan's rifle swung to cover him. Take another step and you'll regret it. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 5 against 1 were impossible odds, but Dan's position on the porch gave him some advantage, and his evident skill with the rifle made the attackers cautious. That's when Catherine heard something that changed everything, the sound of more horses approaching from the direction of town. Father Murphy appeared first, followed by Sheriff Harrison and 3 other men Catherine recognized from her visits to help with livestock problems. They rode hard as if responding to an urgent summons. Sheriff, Dan called out, relief evident in his voice. Perfect timing. Theodore's confident expression faltered slightly as the newcomers spread out effectively surrounding his group. Sheriff Harrison was a man in his 50s, weathered and practical, with the kind of steady presence that came from years of keeping peace in a frontier community. Afternoon, Theodore, the sheriff said mildly. Father Murphy tells me we've got some kind of situation out here. Nothing that concerns you, Harrison, Theodore replied, but his tone had lost its earlier confidence. This is a private business matter. Funny thing about private business, the sheriff observed, is that when it happens on my territory with armed men making threats, it becomes my business real quick. Connor tried to reassert control. Sheriff, this woman is a wanted fugitive. We have authority to... What authority would that be? Sheriff Harrison interrupted. You got papers? Warrants? Anything official? The Irish rider's hesitation answered the question. Whatever authority they claimed was either non-existent or wouldn't stand up to official scrutiny. Father Murphy guided his horse closer to Catherine. My dear, these men have been asking questions in town about you. Specifically, they've been offering money for information about your whereabouts. That kind of behavior tends to make folks suspicious. Catherine realized that the priest's earlier visit hadn't been purely social. He'd been evaluating her character, and when strangers started asking about her, he'd reached his own conclusions about who represented the real threat. Sheriff, she said, her voice stronger now with help at hand, these men are responsible for my father's death in Dublin. They've pursued me here to steal his medical research. That's a serious accusation, Sheriff Harrison said, his hand resting on his sidearm. Theodore, you want to explain why you're riding around my county with armed strangers, making threats against a woman who's been nothing but helpful to my constituents. Theodore's composure was cracking. The plan had clearly depended on taking Catherine quickly and quietly before local authorities could intervene. The presence of the sheriff and several respected community members had changed the equation entirely. You don't understand the forces you're dealing with, he said desperately. These men represent powerful interests. Cross them, and this entire town could suffer. Is that a threat? Sheriff Harrison's voice had gone dangerously quiet. It's a reality, Connor interjected. You're all making a very serious mistake. The only mistake here, Dan said, his rifle still trained on the group, is thinking you could ride onto my property and threaten a lady under my protection. The standoff stretched on for several tense moments. Catherine could see the calculations running behind Connor's eyes, 5 against 7 now, with local law enforcement involved in unfamiliar territory, not the quick, clean operation they'd planned. This isn't over, Connor said, finally backing toward his horse. We'll be back with proper authority. You do that, Sheriff Harrison replied calmly, and next time make sure it's legitimate authority. I've got friends in Denver who can check on warrants and extradition papers real quick. As the threatening riders prepared to leave, Theodore made one last attempt to salvage the situation. Mackenzie, you're making a terrible mistake. That woman will bring nothing but trouble to this valley. Dan's response was steady and final. The only trouble I see is 5 armed men threatening an innocent woman. Don't come back to my land, Blackwood. After the riders departed, silence settled over the ranch yard. Catherine found herself shaking not from cold, but from the aftermath of mortal fear. For a few terrible minutes, she'd thought her flight would end here, with Dan possibly dying to protect her. Miss Sullivan, Sheriff Harrison said gently, I think it's time you told us exactly what we're dealing with here. Catherine looked around the circle of faces, Dan, with his protective concern, Father Murphy with his quiet wisdom, the sheriff with his practical authority, and the other ranchers who had risked their safety to help a woman they barely knew. These people had chosen to trust her to stand against armed men on her word alone. They deserved the truth, or as much of it as she dared share. My father was Professor James Sullivan of Trinity College, Dublin, she began. He was researching treatments for mineral poisoning in both humans and animals. His work threatened the interests of certain mining and industrial concerns. She told him about the threats the laboratory fire her father's death. She explained how she'd fled with his research, hoping to find safety in America. She spoke of her own medical training, carefully framed as assistance to her father's work, rather than formal education in her own right. What she didn't tell them was the complete scope of her knowledge or the true revolutionary potential of her father's discoveries. Some secrets were still too dangerous to share. When she finished, the group stood in thoughtful silence. Finally, Sheriff Harrison spoke. Those men will be back, probably with reinforcements, and possibly with legal documents of some kind. We need to be prepared. What can we do? Dan asked. First, we document everything that happened today. Get statements from everyone present. Second, we reach out to territorial authorities in Helena, make sure they know what's going on. Third, he looked directly at Catherine. We need to make sure you're protected. She can stay here, Dan said immediately. This ranch is defensible, and I'm not afraid of Blackwood or his hired guns. Catherine felt her heart warm at his immediate offer, but her practical mind cataloged the dangers. They'll come back with more men. I can't ask you to risk your life for... You're not asking, Dan interrupted firmly. I'm offering, and it's not just my decision anymore. He gestured toward the other ranchers. Every man here has benefited from your knowledge about livestock health. You've probably saved thousands of dollars worth of cattle in this valley. We look after our own. Besides, Father Murphy added with a slight smile, I suspect the Lord didn't bring you all this way just to let some greedy men steal the knowledge that could help so many people. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes. In Dublin, she'd had her father and their small circle of progressive medical colleagues. Here in this remote mountain valley, she'd found something she'd never expected, a community willing to fight for her right to use her knowledge to help others. There's something else, she said quietly. The research thereafter, it's not just about treating mineral poisoning. My father was developing methods to reverse environmental damage from mining operations, ways to restore poisoned water and soil. Sheriff Harrison whistled low. No wonder they want it buried. That kind of knowledge could put some powerful people out of business, or force them to operate more responsibly, Dan added grimly. As the group began to disperse, making plans for increased vigilance and mutual protection, Catherine found herself alone with Dan for the first time since the confrontation. Are you all right? He asked gently. I think so. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth from the beginning. Dan shook his head. You told me what you could when you could. That's enough. Catherine studied his face, this man who had taken her in when she was desperate, who had stood ready to die defending her from attackers. Why are you doing this? You barely know me. Dan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. My wife and son died 3 years ago, he said finally. There was a doctor passing through town claimed he could help with the fever that took them. But he was a fraud, a charlatan who took my money and made everything worse. Catherine's heart ached for his loss, understanding now the source of the sadness she'd always sensed in him. Since then, Dan continued, I've had no use for anyone claiming medical knowledge. But watching you work, seeing the way you actually heal instead of just taking money and making promises. You're the real thing. And if those bastards think they can suppress knowledge that could save lives, well, they'll have to go through me first. Before Catherine could respond, Dan stepped closer, his calloused hand reaching up to gently touch her face. Besides, he said softly, I've gotten used to having you around. Don't much fancy the idea of losing you to some hired guns. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, but it spoke of possibilities neither of them had dared to voice. When they broke apart, Catherine saw in Dan's eyes not just desire but partnership, recognition, respect for who she truly was. They'll come back, she whispered. Let them, Dan replied firmly. We'll be ready. As they stood together in the gathering dusk, Catherine allowed herself to imagine a future she'd never thought possible, using her knowledge to help people protected by a community that valued her skills, rather than fearing them, loved by a man who saw her as an equal partner, rather than a threat to natural order. It was a beautiful dream, but dreams Catherine knew required fighting for. And somewhere in Silver Creek, Theodore Blackwood was already composing a telegram to Denver calling for reinforcements and fabricated warrants. The battle for Catherine's freedom and the knowledge she carried was just beginning. But for the first time since fleeing Dublin, Catherine Sullivan wasn't running anymore. She had found a place worth defending, people worth protecting, and a man worth fighting alongside. The truth had set her free. Now she had to keep it that way. Thank you so much for joining Catherine and Dan's journey from rejection to redemption, from secrets to truth, and from loneliness to love. If this story of courage, healing, and second chances touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more emotional Western romances. Your support helps us bring you these stories of strong women and the men who love them for exactly who they are. What did you think of Catherine's medical knowledge and Dan's protective nature? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, may you find the courage to be your true self and the love that sees you for who you really are.